A woman drags herself to the temple door in Jerusalem. She is less than 30 years old, but her face looks like 60. The skin on her hands is cracked with open sores from washing other people's clothes against river stones for so long. She carries 2 coins, which together wouldn't buy even a handful of flour, and even so, she puts both of them to the offering box. Everything she has to survive that day. Jesus is watching, and instead of stopping her, he turns to the disciples and says, "This woman gave more than all the rich people who passed through here today. You've heard this story, but what you've probably never stopped to think about is this. What happened to her afterward? When she left the temple with empty pockets, where did she go? What did she eat that night? Where did she sleep?" Because the answer to these questions reveals something that no sermon tells you. Poverty in the biblical world wasn't like the poverty we know today. It was something so brutal, so absolute, so hopeless, that most of us wouldn't survive a week in those conditions. And here is what makes this even more disturbing. When the Bible was written, poverty was not the exception, it was the rule. Historians estimate that between 70 and 90% of the population of the ancient world lived in what we would classify today as extreme poverty, below any line of human dignity we could possibly draw. This means that almost every character you know from the scriptures, with the exception of kings and high-ranking priests, lived in conditions that would make the most precarious slums of the modern world look comfortable. We are talking about a world where there were no hospitals, no retirement, no insurance, no formal jobs. A world where losing a harvest meant watching your children starve to death before your eyes. A world where being a widow without sons was basically a slow death sentence. And a world where debt could literally turn you and your entire family into slaves. So let's do something different in this video. Let's step out of the comfort of theological reading and get into the skin of those who lived this reality. Let's feel the smell, the texture, the weight of being poor 2,000 years ago. Because when you understand this, when you really understand what it meant to be destitute in the world of the Bible, every parable of Jesus changes meaning. Every law of the Old Testament gains an urgency you never noticed, and several passages that you thought were metaphors reveal themselves as literal descriptions of a suffering that was happening right there in front of everyone, every day. Let's start with the most basic thing, the place where a poor person slept. Forget any image of a simple little mud house with a wooden door and a window. That was luxury. That was middle class. The truly poor in first-century Palestine often had no house at all. They slept in caves in the hills surrounding cities, in makeshift shelters made of branches and old fabric, or simply on the ground, out in the open, leaning against the city's outer walls. And those who did have a house? The house of a poor family was a single room made of rough stone and dried mud, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. No window, no chimney, a low opening covered by an old cloth served as a door. The floor was packed earth, not flooring, not tile, earth compacted by the force of being stepped on so much. And here comes the detail that shocks modern archaeologists the most. The whole family and the family's animals slept in this room. The goat, the chickens, sometimes a donkey, all in the same space. The animal's body heat helped warm the environment on the cold nights of the Palestinian winter, which could reach 3 or 4 degrees Celsius in the mountainous regions. Excavations in Capernaum, the city where Jesus established his ministry base, revealed exactly this. The ruins show blocks of houses called insulae, clusters of tiny rooms built right against each other, sharing walls, sharing internal courtyards where several families cooked, washed, and lived together. The roofs were made of wooden beams covered with straw and a layer of mud. Remember the story of the paralytic who was lowered through the roof by 4 friends to the feet of Jesus. Mark chapter 2. Now it makes sense. That roof wasn't a solid structure. It was straw and mud. You could dig a hole through it with your hands. And the furniture? Practically non-existent. A straw mat on the floor for sleeping. Maybe a crude wooden chest to keep the little they had. A clay oil lamp, when they could afford the oil. Many families spent their nights in complete darkness because they couldn't afford the luxury of burning oil for lighting. Now reread the parable of the woman who lost a coin and swept the whole house with a lamp to find it in Luke 15. She wasn't being dramatic. In that dark room, without a floor, with loose dirt on the ground, losing a coin was losing a significant part of everything she owned. And lighting the lamp to search was already an expense of oil that hurt. If housing was already like this, imagine the food. And here we need to destroy another fantasy. When we think of biblical food, we imagine those scenes of a full table, bread, wine, roasted lamb, fruit, honey, feasts like the Last Supper, but that was the table of those who had money, the table of the rich, the priests, the successful merchants. The poor ate once a day, sometimes not at all. The staple of the diet was bread, but not the nice bread you buy at the bakery. It was a flat, hard disc made of barley, the cheapest cereal available. Wheat was for those who could pay. Barley was the grain of the poor, the grain of animals. When the book of Judges, chapter 7, describes a Midianite soldier's dream, where a loaf of barley bread rolls down a hill and destroys a tent, the other soldiers immediately understand. Barley is a symbol of poor people, of despised people. Gideon and his army of destitute peasants. Along with the barley bread, if they were lucky, came olives, raw onion, maybe a handful of cooked lentils. Meat, practically never. A poor peasant could go months without eating meat. Protein came from legumes, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans. Remember the bowl of lentils for which Esau sold his birthright? To us, it seems absurd. For someone who was truly hungry, a warm bowl of lentils was a real temptation. And the wine. It wasn't the sophisticated drink we imagine. The wine of the poor was a vinegar diluted in water called posca. The Romans gave posca to soldiers and slaves. When the soldiers offered vinegar to Jesus on the cross in John 19, they weren't being especially cruel in that specific gesture. They were offering the drink they themselves drank. The drink of those who had nothing better. Now pay attention to this number because it changes everything. Economic historians calculate that a peasant family in first century Palestine spent between 60 and 70% of all their income just on food. 70%. For comparison, in the United States today, the average family spends around 12 to 13%. We are talking about people who worked all day long, from sunup to sundown, and even then, more than half of everything they earned went just toward not starving to death. There was maybe 30% left for clothes, shelter, taxes, and everything else. And when I say taxes, get ready, because that's where things get truly suffocating. If you think the modern tax burden is heavy, what the poor of the biblical world faced will leave you speechless. First century Palestine lived under a triple layer of collections. The first layer was the Roman tax. Rome did not rule Judea out of charity, it ruled to extract wealth. There was the tributum soli, a tax on land. There was the tributum capitis, a head tax, a flat fee that every adult had to pay regardless of how much they earned. Imagine that. You are a peasant who can barely feed your children, and Rome charges you the same fixed amount it charges a rich merchant from Jerusalem. Except for him, it's spare change. For you, it's the difference between eating and going hungry. The second layer was the religious tax. The tithe was not a suggestion, it was a legal obligation. 10% of agricultural production went to the temple, but it wasn't just one tithe. There was the first tithe for the Levites, the second tithe that had to be spent in Jerusalem during religious festivals, and every 3 years, an additional tithe for the poor. In practice, the sum of these religious requirements could reach more than 20% of production. And the third layer, Herod and the local rulers. Herod the Great built entire cities, fortresses, palaces, and that spectacular temple in Jerusalem. Who do you think paid for all that? The people. Additional fees to finance the constructive megalomania of a king who wanted to impress Rome. Add it all up: Roman tax, religious tithes, Herodian fees. Historians like Gildas Hamel and Martin Goodman estimate that the total tax burden on a Jewish peasant could reach 40 or even 50% of everything they produced. Half of everything, for someone who already spent 70% of their income on food. The math simply doesn't add up. And when the math doesn't add up, the most feared thing in the ancient world happens: debt. If this level of exploitation disgusted you as much as it disgusted me while researching, comment, "I didn't know." Because here is where biblical poverty transforms into something we in the modern world simply cannot conceive. In our world, debt means a bad credit score, credit restrictions, collection calls. In the world of the Bible, debt meant slavery, literal, physical, absolute. The mechanism worked like this. When a peasant couldn't pay his taxes or buy seeds for the next planting, he turned to a loan. The lenders, usually large landowners or wealthy merchants, lent with interest which, despite the Mosaic law prohibiting the charging of interest between Jews, they found creative ways to bypass. Contracts were drafted with a value already inflated. Grain was lent after the harvest when it was cheap and collected before the next harvest when it was expensive. The real interest rate could reach 25, 50, even 100%. And when the peasant couldn't pay, first he lost the land. The small plot of ground that was everything his family owned, passed down from generation to generation since the original tribal division described in Joshua, was confiscated. From an owner, he became a tenant, working the same land that was once his, but now paying rent to the new owner. And if even as a tenant he couldn't pay, he and his family were sold as slaves to settle the debt. Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, Deuteronomy 15. The entire Bible is full of laws trying to regulate this brutal cycle. The sabbatical year, every 7 years, mandated the forgiveness of debts. The Jubilee, every 50 years, mandated the return of confiscated lands. These laws existed precisely because the problem was endemic, it was constant, it was the reality for thousands of families who fell into the spiral and couldn't get out. Now, reread the parable of the servant who owed 10,000 talents in Matthew 18. The king orders the servant, his wife, his children, and all his possessions to be sold. When Jesus tells this story, no one in the audience thinks it an exaggeration. No one finds it strange, because that was exactly how it worked. They knew neighbors who had lost everything that way. Maybe they knew entire families who were separated and sold to different creditors. The father sent to one place, the mother to another, the children to a third. When Jesus teaches the disciples to pray, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors," the Greek word used, opelemata, literally means financial debts. It's not just a spiritual metaphor. Jesus is talking to people who owed money, who were afraid of losing their land, who woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, thinking about the creditor who was going to knock on the door. The Lord's Prayer is not abstract. It is the desperate prayer of poor people asking not to be enslaved. But debt and the loss of land were only the beginning of the fall. Because in the ancient world, when you lost your land, you lost much more than property. You lost your identity. In biblical Israel, land was theology. Land was God's promise fulfilled. Each family had its inheritance, its nahala, the piece of ground that God reserved for that specific lineage. To lose the land was, in a sense, to lose your place in the divine covenant. It was a humiliation that went far beyond the financial. It was spiritual, it was existential, and it was the first step in a bottomless fall. Without land, the peasant became a day laborer, what the New Testament calls misthotos, the worker hired by the day. Do you remember the parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20? Those men standing in the square waiting for someone to hire them? It wasn't a poetic image. It was the exact portrait of an entire class of people who woke up every day not knowing if they would eat at night. They went to the city square at dawn and stood there, waiting for a landowner to appear and offer a day's work. 1 denarius a day, the minimum for a family to survive for 24 hours. If no one appeared, there was no plan B. There was no unemployment insurance. There were no government food baskets. There was hunger. And notice the cruel detail of the parable. At 5 in the afternoon, in the last hour of the day, there were still men waiting in the square. Jesus asks them why they stayed there all day doing nothing. The answer is heartbreaking. Because no one hired us. These men stood for 10, 11 hours under the Palestinian sun with an empty stomach, waiting for a chance that never came. And when they are finally hired for a single hour of work, they receive a full denarius, and those who worked all day complain. The parable is about God's grace, yes, but it is built on a reality so concrete, so everyday, that every person in Jesus' crowd knew that despair. Now imagine that this is your life, not for one bad day, for years, decades, with no prospect of improvement, no social mobility, no mechanism to get out of that pit. Because in the ancient world, poverty wasn't a phase, it was a sentence. And it's at this point that we need to talk about those who were below even the day laborers. Because if you think the worker in the square was already at the bottom, the biblical world had layers of misery that descended much further. And the next layer will show you how poverty mixed with something that made everything infinitely worse: disease. In the ancient world, being poor and being sick were practically synonymous. And being sick meant something that in our modern world is almost impossible to imagine. It meant being declared impure, expelled from the community, and abandoned to die slowly outside the city walls. Leviticus 13 and 14 describe the procedure in clinical detail. If someone developed a skin lesion, any spot, any swelling, any discoloration, they had to be taken to the priest, not to the doctor, to the priest. Because disease wasn't seen as a medical issue, it was a ritual issue, spiritual. The priest examined the lesion. If it looked like zarat, the Hebrew word we translate as leprosy, but which actually covered dozens of different skin conditions, from psoriasis to fungal infections, the person was declared impure. And being declared impure meant this: you left the city. You tore your clothes, you let your hair get disheveled, and every time someone approached, you were forced to shout a word, a single word: tameh, unclean, unclean, unclean. Imagine that. You are a family man, a man who worked in the fields, who supported 4 children. A sore appears on your arm, maybe a simple infection that today would be cured with a $5 antibiotic ointment. The priest looks, declares it unclean, and suddenly you are outside the walls. No home, no family, no job. Your children are inside, and you are out here, shouting unclean to whoever passes by, sleeping among rocks, eating what you find in the trash or whatever someone has the mercy to throw on the ground for you, because no one could touch you, no one could get close, no one could hand you food. And here is the detail that most people don't realize. The declaration of impurity wasn't temporary by definition. You stayed unclean until the priest declared otherwise, and for the priest to examine you again, you had to go to him. But to go to him, you had to enter the city. But to enter the city, you had to be clean. Do you see the cycle? Many people who were declared unclean never returned. They died outside, alone, abandoned. And the original disease might not even have been serious. Maybe it was something that would have healed on its own in 2 weeks. But 2 weeks sleeping in the open, without proper food, without care, 2 weeks turned into 2 months, and 2 months turned into a permanent sentence. Now think of the 10 lepers who meet Jesus in Luke 17. The text says they stood at a distance. They didn't even approach. They shouted from afar, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Years of shouting unclean had taught them that distance was their place. That proximity no longer belonged to them. That human touch was something that existed in another life, a life from which they had been expelled. When Jesus says to the leper in Mark 1, "I am willing, be clean," and reaches out his hand and touches him, the scandal isn't the healing. The scandal is the touch. No one touched a leper. No one. And Jesus places his hand on that man's diseased skin as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But skin disease was only one of the ways impurity isolated the poor. There were also bodily discharges. Any abnormal bleeding, any secretion made the person impure. And here, poverty created a particular trap for women. Think of the woman with the flow of blood in Mark 5, the one who touches Jesus' clothes in the middle of the crowd. 12 years of bleeding, 12 years impure. The text says she spent everything she had on doctors and only got worse. This detail isn't secondary, it's central. She started with some resources. Maybe she had land, maybe she had a small savings. The disease consumed everything. Every coin went to healers who promised a cure and delivered failure. And now she was doubly destroyed, sick and poor, impure and bankrupt. No money for a doctor and no ritual status to participate in community life. Anyone she touched became impure until evening. Any bed she sat on, any chair became contaminated. In practice, she lived like a ghost among the living, present but untouchable. And this leads us to a group that the Bible mentions obsessively in almost every book, with an insistence that should bother us: widows and orphans. If you read the Old Testament carefully, you will notice that God repeats a command hundreds of times in different formulations. Care for the widow, care for the orphan. Do not exploit the widow, do not ignore the orphan. The foreigner, the widow, and the orphan are your responsibility. Why so much repetition? Because in the biblical world, losing a husband didn't just mean mourning. It meant total and immediate economic catastrophe. Women could not inherit land in most biblical periods. They could not testify in court in most contexts. They had access to almost no formal profession. A woman's economic existence was tied to a man, father, husband, or son. When the husband died, the widow depended on having an adult son to support her. If she didn't, if the children were small, if she had no children, she fell into the abyss. The book of Ruth is entirely about this. Naomi loses her husband and her 2 sons. Suddenly, 3 women, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, are completely helpless. Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to go back to their original families. It's their only chance. Orpah goes. Ruth stays. And what does Ruth do to survive? She goes to glean, to pick up the leftovers, to follow behind the harvesters in the barley fields, picking up the grains that fell on the ground, the ears that were left in the corners. Leviticus 19 commanded landowners not to harvest to the edges of the field and not to go back to pick up what fell. It was the most primitive social assistance system imaginable, basically leaving crumbs for the desperate. Ruth spent the whole day bent over under the sun, picking up grain by grain. The text says she worked from morning until evening and gathered about an ephah of barley, somewhere around 30 pounds. A full day of grueling work for 30 pounds of grain. And Naomi was impressed. She said it was a lot. That tells you everything about the level of expectation. 30 pounds of barley was an extraordinary blessing for a widow who expected to maybe gather 1 or 2. And notice, Ruth only managed this because Boaz, the owner of that specific field, was a decent man. He told the workers not to bother her and even to drop grains on purpose for her. But what about the widows who weren't lucky enough to find a Boaz? Those who gleaned in the fields of cruel owners, who drove them away, who told the employees to collect every last grain without leaving anything. Proverbs 15, verse 25. The Lord tears down the house of the proud, but he sets the widow's boundary stones in place. This verse is not abstract poetry. It is about real people who moved the boundary stones to steal the piece of ground from a widow who had no way to defend herself. People who looked at a woman alone and saw an opportunity for territorial expansion. The widows who couldn't glean, who had no family, who had no one, ended up in the last stage of all the spirals of poverty in the ancient world, begging. And the beggars of the biblical world were not like those we know in big cities today. They had no municipal shelter to go to at night. They had no NGO distributing soup. They had absolutely no safety net. They positioned themselves at the city gates or at the temple entrances, always in places of passage, and depended entirely on the individual charity of those who passed by. Beggar Bartimaeus, in Mark 10, was blind and sat by the roadside in Jericho, day after day, always in the same place, shouting for mercy. The text says that when he heard Jesus was passing by, he shouted so loud that the crowd tried to quiet him. They told him to be silent. A blind beggar making noise was a nuisance, not a person. But he shouted louder, because for a beggar, every missed opportunity could be the last. There was no guaranteed tomorrow. Every day was a negotiation with death. And there was something worse than being a beggar and sick. The man at the temple gate called Beautiful in Acts 3 had been lame from birth. The text says that friends carried him every day to the temple gate to ask for alms. 40 years of life, and he had never taken a step. He was carried and placed there like an object every day to reach out his hand and wait. When Peter and John pass by him and Peter says, "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus, get up and walk." The man doesn't just walk. The text says he leaps, he jumps. He enters the temple jumping and praising God. 40 years on the ground. 40 years watching feet pass before his face, and suddenly his own feet. Imagine what 40 years of immobility do to a person's mind. Imagine what it's like to be carried like a package your whole life and suddenly realize your legs work. But for every Bartimaeus healed, for every paralytic who found Jesus, there were thousands who never did, thousands who died at the city gates without anyone recording their names. And this raises a question that is rarely discussed in pulpits. How did biblical society justify so much misery? Did people simply ignore it? Did they not care? Or was there something more sinister? A belief system that turned poverty into something deserved? The answer is disturbing. There existed in the Jewish world of the first century a widely held theology that linked wealth to divine blessing and poverty to punishment. The logic was direct. If God is just and all-powerful and you are suffering, then somehow you deserve to suffer. If you are poor, it's because you sinned. If you are sick, it's because God is punishing you. If you were born blind, like the man in John 9, it's because someone sinned. Jesus' own disciples ask, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Do you see the mentality? Poverty and disease did not generate automatic compassion. They generated suspicion. They generated judgment. The victim was seen as guilty. And this theology was extremely convenient for the rich. If wealth is a sign of God's blessing, then the rich man doesn't need to feel guilty. He is rich because God approved of him, and the poor man is poor because God rejected him. The system self-legitimized. And Jesus dynamited this entire logic. Who sinned? The disciples ask. Neither. Jesus answers, not him nor his parents. And then he heals the man, destroying in one gesture both the physical blindness and the theological blindness of those who thought God distributes suffering as punishment. But before Jesus, before this rupture, the theology of retribution had been doing its dirty work for centuries. The book of Job is essentially a protest against this mentality. Job is righteous, and he suffers. His friends show up and spend chapter after chapter trying to convince him that he must have sinned somewhere, because good people don't suffer like this. And Job screams against this logic. He screams against God. He screams against the universe, because he knows he is innocent and yet he is destroyed. Job is the voice of every poor person who heard someone say they deserved what they were going through. And this mentality didn't just justify poverty, it actively made it worse. Because if the poor person was seen as cursed by God, who would want to associate with them? Who would lend without interest to someone God had clearly abandoned? Who would give work to someone marked by divine failure? The theology of retribution created an invisible wall around the destitute, a wall of contempt coated in piety. People could look at a sick beggar at the temple gate and feel not guilt, not compassion, but a comfortable confirmation that the universe was just and they were on the right side of it. That is why, when Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, when he touches lepers, when he talks to widows, when he says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God," it isn't generic kindness. It is a declaration of war against an entire structure of thought. It is the complete inversion of the social and theological order. Jesus isn't just being nice to the poor. He is saying that God is not who you think he is, that poverty is not a sign of a curse, that wealth is not a sign of blessing, that everything built to feel safe and superior is wrong. And this leads us to the most invisible aspect of biblical poverty, something that rarely appears in theological discussions, but that archaeology and social history have been revealing with increasing clarity in recent decades: the cost that misery took on the human body. I'm not talking about hunger or disease, which we've already discussed. I'm talking about raw physical wear and tear, about what happened to the body of a person who worked manually from the age of 6 or 7 until they died. Skeletons excavated from cemeteries of poor communities in Palestine and throughout the ancient Mediterranean tell a story that no text ever wrote. Bones bent by the weight carried since childhood, destroyed joints, teeth worn down to the root, not by cavities, by eating bread made with stone-ground flour, which contained microscopic particles of rock that wore down the enamel with every bite. Women with deformed knees, from spending their whole lives kneeling to grind grain. Men with compressed spines from carrying stones, water, and wood uphill since their teens. The average life expectancy in first-century Palestine was 35 years. 35. This doesn't mean everyone died at 35. The extremely high infant mortality pulled the average down. But even discounting child deaths, a peasant who survived childhood could expect to live, on average, until 45 or 50. And those 45 years were not like ours. At 30, a manual laborer already showed signs that we associate today with a person of 60 or 70. Hunched backs, deformed hands, impaired vision, constant pain. Remember the woman from the beginning of the video, the widow with the 2 coins? Less than 30 years old with a face of 60. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was the faithful portrait of what poverty did to the human body in just a few decades. And here is what makes it even crueler. When the body began to fail, when the worker could no longer carry stones or plow the land, there was no retirement. There was no safety net. There was nothing. If your children could support you, maybe you survived. If not, the street, the temple gate, the corner of the road, another anonymous face among the beggars that the crowd learned not to see. And it was precisely in this class of people, the invisible, those the entire system had discarded, that a new category of poverty emerged in the biblical world. A category that combined material misery with something that was perhaps even more devastating: the complete destruction of identity, of dignity, of the human condition itself. I'm talking about slaves. And not slaves as we usually imagine when we think of the Roman world. Gladiators, domestic servants, Greek tutors. I'm talking about debt slaves, prisoners of war, those born into captivity who never knew anything else. Because slavery in the biblical world was not an institution separate from poverty. It was its final destination. It was the last step on a ladder that only went down. Exodus 21 regulates something that should shock us: selling oneself. If an Israelite man became so indebted that he couldn't pay, he could sell himself as a slave to the creditor. It wasn't a choice. It was the only alternative to death. You owed money, you had no way to pay, and the creditor had the legal right to take your body as collateral, your work, your time, your freedom. All you still possessed was your own flesh. Now it belonged to another, and it wasn't just the debtor. Leviticus 25 and 2 Kings 4 show that the entire family could be dragged in. When the prophet Elisha meets the desperate widow in 2 Kings 4, she cries out, "The creditor is coming to take my 2 sons as his slaves. The husband died, the debt remained, and now the children will pay with their bodies what the father didn't pay with money." Children being torn from their mother to serve in a stranger's house. That was the law working. It wasn't abuse, it wasn't an exception. It was the system operating exactly as it was designed. And the Torah tried to set limits. The Hebrew slave was supposed to be freed in the 7th year. In the Jubilee, every 50 years, all lands were to return to their original owners, and all Israelite slaves were to be released. In theory, the system prevented permanent poverty. Every generation, a reset, a new beginning. In practice, there is no historical evidence that the Jubilee was ever truly implemented. None. The prophets spend entire books denouncing the exploitation of the poor, the concentration of land, debt slavery, which means the legal limits existed on paper, but not in real life. Isaiah 5, verse 8. Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field, till no space is left, and you live alone in the land. This is the portrait of a society where the Jubilee became a dead letter, where the rich accumulated property without restraint, while the poor lost everything. Nehemiah 5 is even more explicit. Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem after the exile and finds the people in despair. Families are mortgaging fields, vineyards, and houses to buy grain during a famine. They are selling sons and daughters as slaves, and Nehemiah is furious. He summons the nobles and officials and says, "What are you doing, charging interest from your own brothers?" The scene is extraordinary because it reveals that even within Israel, even among brothers in faith, the economic exploitation of the vulnerable was routine. But if slavery within the Hebrew system was already brutal, slavery under Rome was another universe of cruelty. In the 1st century, when Jesus lived, Palestine was Roman territory, and Rome was a civilization built literally on the backs of slaves. Conservative estimates suggest that between 25% and 30% of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. In some regions, it reached 40%. These weren't abstract numbers. It meant that on any street in any city of the empire, for every 3 people you passed, 1 was the property of another. Bought, sold, traded, inherited, like an animal, like a tool, like a piece of furniture. Roman law was explicit. The slave was not a person. It was res, a thing, property. The owner could do whatever they wanted: beat, maim, kill. Seneca, the Roman philosopher and contemporary of Jesus, describes dinners where slaves stood all night behind the guests in absolute silence. And if one of them coughed or sneezed, they were whipped right there, in front of everyone, while the others continued eating. And the path to Roman slavery varied, but the result was always the same: prisoners of war. When Rome conquered a region, the population could be entirely enslaved. Josephus reports that in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, 97,000 Jews were captured and sold as slaves. 97,000. Entire families dispersed throughout the empire as merchandise. A father sold in Spain, the mother in North Africa, the children in Greece, separated forever. No communication possible, no hope of reunion. And there were those born slaves. Children of slave women automatically belonged to the mother's owner. They were born as property. They opened their eyes for the first time and already belonged to someone. They didn't choose. They didn't do anything. They simply existed on the wrong side of an arbitrary line that divided humans into people and things. A slave child in Rome could be separated from their mother at any moment. They could be sold at 6 or 7 years old. They could be sent to work in mines, in quarries, on galleys, places where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The mines were the bottom of the bottom. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian from the 1st century BC, visited mines in Egypt and described what he saw in terms that seem like fiction, but aren't. Men, women, and children chained inside tunnels too narrow to stand up in, working in total darkness, on their knees or lying down, breaking rock with primitive hammers, without distinguishing day from night, without rest until the body collapsed. When they collapsed, they stayed where they fell. The others continued working around the body. Diodorus writes that for these slaves, death was more welcome than life, that they prayed to die. And this is a pagan historian speaking, not a Christian trying to sensitize a congregation. It was simply the factual report of someone who looked at the system and described how it worked perfectly. And within this world, a world where a third of the population was property, where children were born as things, where human bodies were consumed in mines and quarries until they were gone. Paul writes a letter to Philemon, a short letter, personal, about a runaway slave named Onesimus. Onesimus fled from his owner Philemon, found Paul in prison and converted. Paul sends him back. But the letter he sends with him is extraordinary. Paul doesn't say, "I'm returning your property." He says, "Receive him back, no longer as a slave, but a beloved brother." Brother, not a thing, not property, brother. In a society where a runaway slave could be legally branded with a hot iron, crucified or killed, Paul asks Philemon to embrace Onesimus's family. Paul even says, "If he owes you anything, put it on my account." He is offering to pay the slave's debt. He is putting his own name down as a guarantor for a fugitive. In a single letter, Paul dissolves the boundary between person and property that sustained the entire Roman economic system. But it would be dishonest to romanticize it. Paul did not call for the abolition of slavery. Neither did Jesus explicitly. And that has bothered many people over the centuries. Rightly so. But what both Jesus and the apostles did was something that was perhaps more subversive in the long run. They destroyed the philosophical basis that made slavery acceptable. If every human being is the image of God, everyone without exception, then no human being can be a thing. If in Christ there is neither slave nor free, as Paul writes to the Galatians, then the legal distinction that sustains slavery is a lie. If the last shall be first, and the first shall be last, then every hierarchy based on power and possession is living on borrowed time. It took centuries, it took millennia, it cost blood. But the seed was planted there, in that one-page letter, in that absurd request. Treat the slave as a brother. And while slaves, beggars, lepers, and widows occupied the different rungs of this ladder of misery, there was one element that ran through all of them. A constant reality that united all the poor of the biblical world in a common experience: hunger. I've already mentioned hunger at the beginning of this video, but I want to come back to it now, not as a concept, but as a daily experience. Because hunger in the ancient world was not what we imagine. It wasn't skipping a meal. It wasn't the feeling of an empty stomach that we feel when lunch is late. It was a permanent state of the body. a mode of existence. The poor peasant of first-century Palestine lived in a chronic state of malnutrition. They ate, yes, when they could, but never enough. Never with the necessary variety, never with the regularity that the body needed. The result was an organism perpetually weakened, perpetually vulnerable, perpetually on the edge between functioning and collapsing. The basic diet was bread and water, sometimes olives, rarely lentils. Meat was something that most poor people ate maybe 2 or 3 times a year, at religious festivals, when an animal was sacrificed in the temple and parts were distributed. The rest of the year, animal protein simply didn't exist in the life of a poor peasant, and this had consequences that went beyond the stomach. Iron, vitamin, and protein deficiencies meant children who didn't grow right, bones that didn't form correctly, immune systems that couldn't fight off simple infections. It meant mothers who died in childbirth because their bodies had no nutritional reserve to support the pregnancy. It meant babies who were born weak and died in days. Remember the infant mortality statistic? About 30% didn't make it to age 5. The chronic hunger of the mothers was one of the central reasons. Children were born already in a deficit, already owing calories they never received. And it's in this context that certain passages of the Bible gain a weight that we simply lose when we read them with a full stomach. When Jesus feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, it isn't just an impressive miracle. It is God looking at a hungry crowd, real hunger, chronic hunger, hunger that defines every day of those people's lives, and saying, I see you, I know you are hungry, and today, here, now, you are going to eat until you are satisfied. The text makes a point of saying that 12 baskets were left over. They didn't just eat, there was extra. For people who never had extra food, who calculated every grain, who rationed every piece of hard bread to stretch until the next day, the leftover was almost more scandalous than the miracle. Abundance, a word that didn't belong to the vocabulary of the poor. And Jesus delivered it for free, in the middle of nowhere, without asking for anything in return. When Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, the first practical thing he includes is, give us this day our daily bread. Not for the week, not for the month, for the day. Because for the poor of the first century, life was literally one day at a time. You didn't plan the week, you didn't plan the month. You woke up and the question was only one, will I eat today? And the answer wasn't always yes. The Lord's Prayer is not generic. It is the prayer of people who knew what it meant to go to sleep hungry without knowing if there would be bread tomorrow. Every word of that prayer bleeds real experience. Forgive us our debts, because debt was what destroyed families. Lead us not into temptation, because when hunger strikes, the temptation to steal, to lie, to sell oneself was constant. Deliver us from evil, because evil for the poor wasn't abstract. It had a face, it had a name. It was the creditors, the tax collectors, the Roman soldiers, the landowners who took everything and left nothing. And perhaps the most impressive thing of all, the detail that joins this whole video into a single point, is what Jesus does with poverty in his own story. He isn't born rich, he isn't born middle class. He is born in a stable because his parents had nowhere to stay. He is presented in the temple with the offering of the poor, 2 turtle doves instead of a lamb, because the family didn't have money for a lamb. He grows up in an irrelevant village. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Nathanael asks with contempt. He works with his hands as a carpenter, or more likely as a stonemason, because the Greek word tekton refers to a manual construction laborer. And during his ministry, he himself says, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The creator of the universe, according to Christian theology, slept wherever he could. He depended on the hospitality of others. He had no house, he had no property, he had no savings. This is not accidental. It isn't a secondary biographical detail. It is the center of the message. God didn't look at poverty from above. He didn't send instructions from heaven on how to deal with the poor. He entered it. He wore its skin. He felt the hunger, the exhaustion, the lack of shelter, the vulnerability of having no money in a world that only respects those who do. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," he isn't theorizing. He is speaking as one of them. And when, in Matthew 25, he says, "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." And the righteous ask, "When did we do this, Lord?" The answer is, "Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Every beggar at the city gate was him. Every widow gleaning grain in the field was him. Every slave chained in the mine was him. Every hungry child, every leper outside the walls, every debtor selling their own body, him. And that changes everything, because if God identifies with the poor to this extent, if he literally puts himself in their place, then poverty is not incidental in the Bible. It is central. It isn't the background of the story of salvation. It is the story itself. Every prophet who shouted against injustice, every law that protected the foreigner and the widow, every psalm that cried out for justice, every act of Jesus that touched, healed, fed, and restored the destitute, everything points in one single direction. Poverty is not God's will. It is what happens when human beings disobey everything God asked, when they concentrate instead of distributing, when they exploit instead of protecting, when they transform brothers into merchandise and dignity into debt. Every person going hungry in the biblical world was evidence not of divine justice, but of human failure. And the entire Bible, from the first chapters of Genesis to the last visions of Revelation, is the record of God trying to convince humanity to do differently. If this video touched you, click on the one appearing now on your screen, because the story it tells has everything to do with what you just watched. Quick note, the CTA you asked for. If this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more. Is marked as a burned phrase in your memory rules. I used a different variation in the closing. Here is the continuation, and maybe you are thinking, but that was 2,000 years ago. The world has changed. Slavery was abolished. We have labor laws, human rights, healthcare systems. We have supermarkets with entire aisles of food that no one will buy and that will end up in the trash before the end of the week. Biblical poverty stayed in the past, right? Look around. According to United Nations data, almost 700 million people on the planet live today on less than $2.15 a day. 700 million. To put it in perspective, it's as if the entire population of the Roman Empire at its peak, every citizen, every slave, every child, were living in extreme poverty. And you multiplied that number by 10. The scale has changed. The essence has not. There are still people who wake up not knowing if they will eat. There are still children who don't grow right because their bodies don't receive the minimum. There are still mothers who die in childbirth because they never had access to proper nutrition. The clothes have changed. The geography has changed. The hunger has not. And debt, that same debt that in Leviticus sold entire families, that in 2 Kings tore children from their mothers, continues to operate with the same logic, except now it wears a suit and talks about compound interest. In the ancient world, the creditor knocked on your door and took your son. In the modern world, the system is cleaner. No one physically drags anyone away, but the result is similar. Families that work their whole lives and never get anywhere, who pay 3, 4, 5 times the value of everything they buy, who transfer debt from generation to generation as if it were an inheritance, because in a way, it is. The mechanism that the Jubilee tried to interrupt, the infinite accumulation on one side and the infinite loss on the other, was never interrupted. It keeps turning. and Isaiah 5 remains current. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until no space is left. Has formal slavery ended? On paper, yes. In practice, the International Labour Organization estimates that more than 27 million people today live in conditions of forced labor. 27 million human beings at this moment, while you watch this video, working in factories, farms, mines, fishing boats, brothels, unable to leave, without receiving fair payment, under threat of violence. Diodorus Siculus describes slaves in the mines of Egypt, chained in tunnels too dark to stand up in. Today there are children in cobalt mines in the Congo in conditions that Diodorus would recognize. Technology has advanced 2 millennia. The human disposition to consume the body of another human being for profit has not advanced a day. And that is exactly why this video is not just a history lesson, because what the Bible describes about poverty is not a portrait of the past. It is a permanent diagnosis of the human condition. The prophets were not describing the problems of an era. They were naming patterns that repeat in every civilization, in every century, in every economic system that human beings have ever invented. The concentration of wealth, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the transformation of people into disposable resources, the indifference of those who have toward the suffering of those who do not. Amos shouted against this in the 8th century BC. 2,800 years later, the shout is still necessary, but the Bible does not end with the diagnosis. If it did, it would just be a document of denunciation, important but incomplete. What makes the biblical text different from any other ancient record of poverty is that it doesn't just describe the suffering, it insists, with a stubbornness that spans 40 authors, 66 books, and more than 1,000 years of writing, that it doesn't have to be this way, that another possibility exists, that hunger, debt, slavery, and abandonment are not the inevitable fate of humanity, but the result of choices, and that choices can be different. Every law in Torah about leaving ears of grain in the field was a choice. Every prophet who confronted a king was a choice. Every time Jesus touched a leper instead of looking away, sat with a tax collector instead of condemning him, fed a crowd instead of sending them away, it was a choice. Small, individual, concrete. None of these choices solved the world's poverty. None eliminated hunger from the face of the earth, but each of them said something that the system refused to say. This person matters. This suffering is not acceptable. This life has value. I started this video with a question. What was it like to be poor in biblical times? Now you know. You know it was waking up with pain in bones that never formed correctly. You know it was calculating every grain of barley like someone counting the remaining days of their life. You know it was seeing your children taken by a creditor and being unable to do anything. You know it was carrying a disease that turned your body into a prison and your existence into a sentence of exile. You know it was looking at the horizon and seeing no way out, none in any direction under any sky. But you also know, and this is perhaps the most important thing, that in the middle of this darkness, someone looked at those whom the world discarded and said, "You are the first, blessed, favored, blessed." Not in spite of the poverty, but because the kingdom of God belongs exactly to those whom the world decided deserved nothing. 2,000 years later, the question has not changed. It remains the same as always. The same one God asked Cain at the beginning of everything, before kings, before temples, before empires, "Where is your brother?" Cain's answer, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is the answer that humanity continues to give. To every hungry child ignored, to every indebted family abandoned, to every invisible person on the streets of every city on the planet. The entire Bible can be read as God repeating the same question, generation after generation. waiting for someone to finally answer differently. For someone to say, yes, I am, yes, and do something about it. Now click on the video appearing on your screen. I selected it especially for those who watched this one until the end.